I buried Bastien on a Thursday under a sky so painfully blue it felt obscene. The kind of blue that suggests life goes on without asking permission. People often say funerals blur together, that grief erases detail, but that wasn't true for me. I remember everything. The way the wind lifted the edge of the program from my hands, the faint smell of cut grass beneath the perfume of flowers, the sound of my Katie's heels clicking impatiently against the pavement. She was always in a hurry. I stood between my children, my black coat too heavy for the mild afternoon, my wedding ring catching the sun every time I moved my hand. I hadn't taken it off yet. I didn't know how. Bastien's coffin was lowered slowly, as if the earth itself needed time to accept him. I watched until the last inch disappeared, my chest tight but strangely dry. I had cried weeks earlier alone at night. Now, there was only weight. Stone cleared his throat beside me. "Are you okay, Mom?" he asked, already glancing toward the waiting cars. I nodded. Yes, it was the first lie of many. I wandered into the living room and sat in Bastien's chair. No one stopped me. No one asked if I needed anything. They were busy moving through the space like inspectors, not mourners. The will had been read 3 days earlier. We entered Wiley Fisher, the attorney's office. Katie, Stone, and Maggie sat stiffly across from me, hands folded, eyes alert in a way grief should never look. Mr. Fisher opened a folder, cleared his throat, and while adjusting his spectacles, looked at me and said, "Mrs. Ruby Walker, your husband, Bastien Walker, had left his entire estate to you. The house, the shared bank account, the cabin in the woods, and the trust." The silence that followed wasn't respectful. It was calculating, and I saw it immediately. The slight tightening of Katie's mouth, Stone's jaw clenched, and Maggie staring down, processing faster than she wanted anyone to know. I sat in shocked silence. Bastien had left nothing to our children. Not one of them protested. They just sat quietly. Back at the house Bastien and I had shared for 52 years, I walked the hallway slowly, running my fingers along the wall where Bastien had leaned every night to remove his shoes. I pressed my palm there now, as if memory could be absorbed through plaster. "You should rest," Katie said behind me. "You've had a long day." It sounded kind, it wasn't. That night, I lay awake listening to my own house breathly. Pipes ticking, floorboards settling, and I realized something that hollowed me out in one clean motion. I was no longer surrounded by family. I was surrounded by expectation, and expectation, I would learn, is far more dangerous than grief. Inheritance has a sound, though no one ever talks about it. It doesn't arrive with the thud of a gavel or the crisp snap of an envelope being opened. It arrives softly, insinuating itself into rooms, into conversations that stop when you enter, into the way people begin to measure your presence against what you own. It sounds like footsteps hesitating outside a bedroom door, like drawers closing too quickly, like voices lowering when they think you cannot hear. By the 3rd week after the funeral, my children had stopped knocking. At first I told myself it was comfort, familiarity bred by grief. They had grown up in this house. They knew its rhythms. They knew which steps creaked and which windows stuck. But grief has a way of sharpening your senses, and I began to notice the difference between comfort and entitlement. I noticed how quickly my children spread out. Doors opened, drawers slid, coats were placed where they didn't belong. Ownership doesn't wait for permission. Cupboards opened without asking. Mail was sorted without consultation. My handbag was moved once, twice, from where I always left it. Small things. Small things are how people test boundaries. I spent my days moving slowly through the house, learning how to be alone inside a space that had once been shared. I cooked out of habit rather than hunger, setting the table for 2 before remembering there was no second place to fill. Bastien's chair remained empty. No one sat in it. They avoided it, as if respect still lingered there, even as other lines blurred. One afternoon, I returned from the garden with dirt under my nails and found Stone standing in the hallway, arms crossed, surveying the walls. "We should repaint," he said without greeting me. "Lighter colors. It'll help with resale." Resale. The word struck me like a slap. "I'm not selling," I said quietly. He frowned as though I'd misspoken. "Not now," he clarified. "Eventually." Eventually. A future already imagined without me in it. That evening, Katie took it a step further. She sat beside me at the kitchen table, her voice gentle, her hand resting just long enough on my wrist to feel rehearsed. "Mom, have you thought about letting us help with the paperwork?" she asked. "Dad handled all of that. It's a lot for one person." She said handled, not trusted. I stirred my tea slowly, watching the steam rise. "I'm managing," I replied. She smiled tight and patient. "We just don't want you to get overwhelmed." Overwhelmed. It was becoming their favorite word. I didn't sleep that night. I lay listening, alert in a way grief had taught me to be. Sometime after midnight, I heard the soft scrape of the study drawer opening. I rose quietly and stood just outside the door, my bare feet cold against the floor. Inside, paper shifted. Then Maggie's voice, low and urgent, floated out. "No, it's not here. I've checked everything." A pause. "Yes, I'm sure. He would have kept it close." Another pause, sharper this time. "No, we can't wait forever. She's not herself right now." My chest tightened. "She won't notice," Maggie continued. "She barely eats. She cries all the time." I pressed my hand against the wall to steady myself. "We just need to be ready." Ready? For what? I retreated before she could sense me there, my heart pounding not with fear, but with clarity. They weren't worried about me, they were managing me. The realization settled heavily, rearranging everything I thought I knew about motherhood, about sacrifice, about the quiet agreements we believe exist between parent and child. The next morning, I let myself look smaller. I forgot my glasses on purpose, asked the same question twice, burned toast I knew how to make with my eyes closed. When corrected, me impatient slipping through her smile, I apologized. "I'm sorry," I said softly. "Your father always handled these things." I saw the relief on her face, relief that I was slipping into the role they needed me to play. That afternoon while they were out, I opened the desk drawer Bastien had always kept locked. Inside was a leather folder worn soft at the edges and a single key taped neatly inside the cover. The cabin key. Beneath it, a note in his familiar hand. "If they ever stop seeing you as a person, go here. Everything you need is already waiting." I sank onto the floor and pressed the note to my chest. Then I cried. It wasn't from grief, but from the sudden crushing knowledge that Bastien had seen this coming. He had trusted me with everything, and now I would have to trust myself. The lawyer Bastien had circled in red ink didn't smile when we met. That mattered. His office sat above a bakery, the smell of warm bread rising faintly through the floorboards, an oddly comforting contrast to the subject matter that would soon take over my life. The furniture was functional, not impressive. No awards on the wall, no photographs of powerful men shaking hands, just shelves and files all in order. When I sat, he introduced himself as Griffin Thatcher and listened without interrupting while I spoke. I told him about the funeral, the will, the way my children had begun moving through my home as if it were already theirs. I told him about the whispered phone calls, the paperwork touched without permission, the language they used. Overwhelmed, safe, eventually. When I finished, he leaned back slightly and folded his hands. "They're already acting," he said calmly. "They just don't realize how visible they are." I let that settle. Visibility had never frightened my children. They believed themselves untouchable, shielded by blood, by grief, by the assumption that a mother would never fight her own. "What can I do?" I asked. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he opened a file and slid a single page toward me. "This," he said, "is what your husband anticipated." I recognized his handwriting instantly. Trust structures, contingency clauses. Legal language softened just enough to sound human, but sharp enough to cut. He was very specific, Griffin continued. He didn't believe in punishment. He believed in consequence. I swallowed. He trusted you, Griffin added, not them. That sentence rewired something inside me. We spoke for hours. He explained how inheritance wasn't about what people expected, but about timing, control, and intent. How trusts could be invisible to those who weren't meant to see them. How assets could move quietly, legally, without triggering suspicion. You don't confront, he said firmly. You observe. You document. You let them make the mistakes. Mistakes. I nodded slowly. The first move came days later. A discretionary trust was created in my name alone, clean, quiet, unassuming. Properties transferred into holding entities that existed only on paper. Accounts reorganized, layered, shielded. On paper, nothing changed, but in reality, everything did. At home, I played my part carefully. I asked Katie to help me with the bills and praised her for being so good with numbers. I let Stone speak over me at dinner, pretending not to notice. I allowed Maggie to correct my memory, even when I knew I was right. I made myself smaller, and in doing so, I watched them grow careless. One evening, they gathered around the dining table, my dining table, as if convening a meeting. "Mom," Stone began, voice practiced. "We've been talking." "Of course you have," I thought. "We're worried about you living alone," Maggie added, her eyes soft but guarded. "Dad always handled the finances." "It's a lot," I nodded, folding my hands in my lap. "I don't understand it all anymore," I admitted. "Your father took care of those things." That was when Katie leaned forward. "We could make it easier," she said. "Power of attorney, just in case." The phrase landed softly, but it carried weight. "I wouldn't want to be a burden," I said. They exchanged glances. They thought they were winning. That night, I signed something, not the power of attorney, a safeguard. The next morning, Griffin called. "It's in place," he said. "If they push, financially or legally, it will trigger protections they don't even know exist." I thanked him and hung up. Then I sat in my kitchen and waited because traps only work when people believe they're safe, and my children had never felt safer. There is a moment in every betrayal when the injured party realizes the wound will not heal on its own. For me, it came quietly on an ordinary afternoon, beneath the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock Bastian had hung crooked years ago. I stood in the hallway watching Maggie sort through my mail, her movements efficient, unquestioning. She didn't look at me, she didn't ask, she simply assumed. I waited for irritation to rise, for anger to demand expression, but what came instead was something colder. Understanding. They no longer saw me as a person capable of consent. I was a process now, a transition phase between what had been Bastian's and what they believed would be theirs. "Mom," Stone said from the kitchen, "we're moving some things around." He didn't ask, just informed. I followed the sound of his voice and stopped short in the doorway. The dining room table was covered in paperwork, my paperwork, insurance policies, property tax records. Old bank statements pulled from files I hadn't opened in years. Someone had even found the copy of my marriage certificate creased at the edges from handling. They hadn't just crossed a line, they had dismantled it. "What is this?" I asked. Katie glanced up, smiling as if caught doing something thoughtful. "We're organizing," she said. "You shouldn't have to worry about this stuff anymore." The word "anymore" scraped against me. "I didn't ask you to," I replied quietly. Stone sighed, a sound I recognized from his teenage years, when patience was something he believed only adults were required to have. "This affects all of us, Mom." There it was, the redefinition. I nodded and stepped back. That night, I cried in the shower. I didn't cry because of what they had done. I cried because of what it confirmed. I had believed motherhood created an unspoken protection, that sacrifice earned loyalty, that love, given long enough, built immunity. I was wrong. The deepest betrayal came from the one I trusted most, Maggie. She had always been the gentle one, the observer, the child who stayed behind when the others ran ahead. She had held my hand at the funeral longer than the rest, had whispered I miss him too, as though grief were something we shared privately. That was why hearing her voice low and conspiratorial felt like a blade sliding between my ribs. "She remembers more than you think," Maggie said from the hallway. "She asks questions." Katie's reply was sharp. "She's confused. That's not the same thing." A pause. "I just don't want this to blow up," Katie continued. "What if she changes her mind?" "She won't," Maggie said. "She's terrified of being alone." I pressed my fingers against the doorframe, my breath shallow. Terrified of being alone, as if solitude were the worst thing that could happen to a woman who had survived marriage, childbirth, loss, and now this. That night, I opened the locked box beneath my bed. Inside were copies of every legal move I had made, every safeguard, every protection. I was filled with grief because I finally understood that the children I had raised, the children I would have bled for, were willing to dismantle me piece by piece if it meant comfort for themselves. The next day, I called Katie and asked her to come over alone. When she arrived, I sat at the table with a folder in front of me and let my shoulders slump. "I'm scared," I told her. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore." Her face softened immediately. She reached for my hand, her thumb brushing my skin in a gesture so practiced it made my stomach turn. "I know, Mom," she said gently. "We're just trying to help." I slid the folder toward her. "I think I should sign whatever you think is best." Her fingers trembled as she opened it. Inside were documents that looked real enough to convince her. They were not. She smiled slowly, relief and victory mixing in her expression. In that moment, something inside me hardened permanently. They didn't hate me. They had simply stopped seeing me as human, only as an obstacle. That night, I slept soundly because once illusion dies, only truth remains. Greed is impatient. It doesn't understand waiting. It convinces itself that delay is danger, that caution is weakness, that whatever it wants must be taken before someone else realizes it exists. After I handed Katie those papers, after she left my house wearing the quiet triumph of someone who believes the end is inevitable, the atmosphere shifted again. They stopped pretending. Stone began parking his car in Bastian's place without asking, leaving it there overnight as if to test whether the space was already his. Katie spoke openly about updating the house, pointing out walls she'd knock through, fixtures she'd replace. "When we sell," she said one evening, as casually as if discussing the weather. I didn't correct her. Correction teaches caution. Silence teaches recklessness. Maggie withdrew. She watched more than she spoke, her eyes tracking the subtle changes in power, the raised voices, the sharp edges creeping into conversations that once passed for family meals. At night, I lay awake listening. Listening had become my discipline. The first real mistake came sooner than I expected. I was lying in bed when I heard raised voices downstairs, not whispers this time, but the strained urgency of people who believe they are running out of time. "She signed," Katie said. "I saw it." "That doesn't mean it's active," Stone replied. "Banks don't move that fast." "We can't just sit around," Maggie said quietly. "What if something goes wrong?" Something already had, they just didn't know it yet. "We should try again," Stone muttered, "just to see." That was when I rolled onto my side and stared into the dark, a strange calm settling over me. They were about to announce themselves. The next morning, my phone rang while I was making coffee. It was Griffin. "They attempted to access a restricted account," he said, "one that no longer exists in the form they believe it does." I closed my eyes and breathed out slowly. Did it work? No, he replied, but it created a record. Records are unforgiving. They use documentation that is either outdated or unauthorized, he continued, which means this wasn't an accident. I imagined Katie's confident smile faltering for the first time. Good, I said quietly. That afternoon, I let myself collapse at the kitchen table. I cried openly, loud enough to be heard. I pressed my hands to my face and let my shoulders shake. Katie found me there. What happened? She asked, alarm breaking through her composure. I don't understand it, I sobbed. The bank says something isn't right. I thought you were helping me. Her face paled. Oh, Mom, she said quickly, wrapping her arms around me. These things get complicated. She said it the way Bastian once had, explaining taxes or insurance, except she didn't understand the system the way he did. That difference would cost her. Stone arrived later, agitation radiating off him. This is exactly why we need control, he snapped. Before something goes wrong. Something had gone wrong, just not for me. That night, I returned to the locked box beneath my bed and reread Bastian's letter. I had focused on the legal instructions before, the safeguards and contingencies. This time, I noticed the final line I had ignored. They will reveal themselves. Let them. I folded the letter carefully. The trap was no longer theoretical, it had been sprung. Trust doesn't shatter. It decomposes. It softens at the edges, grows porous, begins to smell rotten long before anyone admits it's gone. By the time my children realized something was failing between them, the damage was already irreversible. The house changed again. Doors closed more often. Conversations stopped abruptly when I entered a room. Phones were taken into corners. Voices lowered not out of respect, but suspicion. They no longer trusted one another. Greed had turned them inward. The first accusation slipped out one evening while they thought I was distracted with the television. You moved too fast, Katie snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut through the room. I told you to wait. Stone's head snapped up. I didn't do anything you didn't agree to, he shot back. You said she signed. She did, Katie insisted. I watched her. Then why didn't it work? Maggie asked quietly. Thick, uncomfortable silence followed. I turned down the volume on the television and watched them from the corner of my eye, my hands folded calmly in my lap. I felt no triumph, only a deep, aching sadness that this was what remained of the children I had raised. Stone stood and began pacing, agitation radiating off him. I don't like this, he said. Someone screwed up. Katie's eyes narrowed. Are you saying I did? I'm saying someone rushed, he replied, and now everything's flagged. The word carried weight even they couldn't ignore. That night, Katie knocked on my bedroom door. She stood there uncertainly, her hand hovering near the frame as though permission were no longer assumed. Mom? She said softly. I sat up. Yes? She stepped inside and closed the door behind her, perching on the edge of the bed the way she used to when she was small. Have you changed anything? She asked. Since Dad died? I studied her face, the guilt there, the fear, the dawning realization that she was standing on the wrong side of something she couldn't outrun. I don't understand much anymore, I said gently. Why do you ask? She swallowed. Things aren't adding up. I reached out and covered her hand with mine. I thought you were taking care of me. Her fingers tightened around mine. We are, she said. We need to make sure you're safe. Safe. The word had become a cage. The next morning, Griffin called earlier than usual. They contacted the old firm, he said. Bastian's original attorneys. My chest tightened. And that triggered a review, he continued, which connected some dots they didn't intend to connect. What does that mean for them? I asked. It means any further attempts could be interpreted as coercive, he said evenly. Coercive. A word with teeth. That afternoon, the house exploded. Katie accused Stone of sabotaging everything. Stone accused her of forging signatures. Maggie cried openly, insisting she only went along with it because she didn't want to be excluded. Excluded. As if betrayal were a club with membership benefits. I retreated to my room and locked the door. I needed distance from the sound of my children dismantling themselves. That evening, Katie stood outside my door. "Mom," she said carefully, "we need to talk." "I'm tired," I replied. "We'll talk tomorrow." The word hung between us, heavy with implication because tomorrow was when consequences would begin to arrive, and none of them were ready. Legal consequences rarely announce themselves with drama. They arrive quietly through envelopes slid beneath doors, emails written in language so careful it feels almost kind. They do not accuse, they document, and documentation is merciless. The first letter arrived on a Tuesday morning. I recognized the return address immediately, so did Katie. She froze mid-step in the hallway, her hand tightening around the strap of her handbag as her eyes locked onto the envelope resting on the console table. "What's that?" she asked, forcing a brightness into her voice that rang hollow. "I don't know," I said mildly. "Why don't you open it?" Her fingers twitched toward the envelope, then pulled back as if burned. "No," she said quickly. "It's yours." I waited until she left the room before opening it. Inside was a formal notice, measured, precise, devastating in its restraint. It referenced unauthorized attempts to access protected assets, outlined fiduciary boundaries, and warned politely of potential legal exposure should such attempts continue. I read it twice, then I folded it carefully and slipped it back into the envelope. That evening, my children gathered again in the living room, but the tone had shifted. There was no pretense of concern, only tension, sharp and brittle. "They sent a notice," Stone said flatly. "I know," Kay replied too quickly. "It doesn't mean anything yet." "It means everything," he snapped. "They're watching now." I sipped my tea, the warmth grounding me. "Who's watching?" I asked. All three of them turned to look at me. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. "No one, Mom," Katie said. "Just routine procedures." Routine. The same word she'd used when she first went through my papers. I nodded. "If you say so." That was when Maggie spoke. "I don't want to do this anymore." The room stilled. "What?" Katie hissed. "I said I'm done," she repeated, her voice trembling. "This isn't what Dad would have wanted." Stone scoffed. "Don't pretend this is about him now." But Maggie was crying. "I just wanted us to be okay," she sobbed. "I didn't think it would turn into this." I watched her, not as a mother, but as a witness. This was the fracture Bastian had foreseen. Someone always breaks first. That night, Maggie came to my room. She sat on the edge of my bed, the way she used to when she was a child, her shoulders hunched, eyes red and hollow. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I should have protected you." I placed my hand on her back. "I know," I said, and I meant it. But forgiveness doesn't erase consequence. The next morning, Griffin called again. "They crossed another threshold," he said. "One of them contacted the bank directly." I closed my eyes. "Which one?" "There's ambiguity," he replied, "and that ambiguity works in your favor." Of course it did. They had lost the ability to act as one. By afternoon, Stone was furious, Katie frantic, and Maggie withdrawn into silence. And I began packing a small bag because it was time to remind them of something they had forgotten, that I was not anchored to them. That evening, I left a note on the kitchen counter. "I'm going away for a few days. I need rest." I didn't say where, and I didn't say when I'd return. As I drove toward the cabin, the road unfolding ahead of me like a promise, my phone buzzed repeatedly in my bag. I didn't answer because absence, I had learned, is sometimes the loudest form of authority. The cabin didn't demand anything from me. That was the first thing I noticed when I unlocked the door and stepped inside. No expectations, no questions disguised as concern, no careful watching of my hands to see what I might give away. Just quiet. The air smelled so fresh, the kind of fresh that suggests permanence rather than possession. Bastien had chosen this place deliberately, far enough to disappear, close enough to return if needed. I set my bag down and stood in the center of the room, listening. No ticking clock, no footsteps overhead, no voices deciding my future. That night, I slept deeply without dreams, without tension coiled in my spine. When I woke, sunlight spilled across the wooden floor in long, unapologetic lines. I brewed coffee and sat at the small table by the window, letting the steam warm my face. Then I turned my phone over. 17 missed calls, 23 messages. The progression was almost academic. Concern, irritation, panic. Mom, where are you? Please answer. This isn't funny. We need to talk. Now. Need, not want, not care. Need. I set the phone face down and opened the folder Bastien had hidden so carefully. This was the part they never imagined existed. The inheritance was not a single account or a lump sum waiting to be divided. It was layered, carefully structured, insulated by time and intent. Assets nested within trusts. Trusts nested within conditions. Conditions triggered not by my death, but by behavior. He had not designed it to reward. He had designed it to reveal. I read the clause again, slower this time. Any attempt by heirs to coerce, manipulate, or prematurely access assets held in trust shall result in immediate forfeiture of all future claims. It wasn't vindictive, it was protective. I had wondered before if I would hesitate. I didn't. By midday, Griffin called. "They're contacting everyone," he said. "Banks, advisors, extended family." I smiled faintly. And? "And they're being met with silence," he replied. "No confirmation, no access, no reassurance." Reassurance had always been my role. It felt strangely liberating not to provide it. That afternoon, I received a text from Maggie. "Mom, where are you? Are you at the cabin?" "I am," I replied. "May I come over? Please?" "Of course." 3 hours later, there was a knock at the door. I opened, and Maggie stood on the porch, shoulders slumped, eyes shadowed by exhaustion that had nothing to do with sleep. "I just wanted to see if you were okay," she said quietly. I stepped aside and let her in. We sat together at the table, the space between us heavy but no longer hostile. "They're panicking," she admitted. "They think you're doing this to punish them." I met her gaze. "I'm doing this to protect myself." She nodded slowly. "I know." We didn't say more than that. Some truths are complete without witnesses. When she left, I stood in the doorway and watched her walk down the path, a figure caught between loyalty and survival. That evening, Katie sent a message that made my hands go cold. "If you don't come back and fix this, we'll have no choice but to take legal action." I stared at the words until they blurred, then I forwarded the message to Griffin. His response came quickly. "Thank you. This helps." I turned my phone off after that because silence does more than protect. It exposes, and the longer it holds, the more devastating the reveal becomes. That night I sat by the fire and allowed myself a single thought that felt dangerous and honest. I was no longer reacting, I was deciding. Legal escalation doesn't arrive with shouting, it arrives with language. Cold, formal, precise language that leaves no room for reinterpretation once it exists on paper. It arrives in inboxes and registered mail, in phrases that sound neutral but carry consequences sharp enough to draw blood. The first letter came from Katie's attorney. I didn't open it, I didn't need to. I recognized the posture immediately, the shift from persuasion to threat, from family to adversary. I slid the envelope back into my bag and drove to the cabin post office, where I mailed it unopened to Griffin. His call came that evening. "They're alleging undue influence," he said calmly, "claiming you were manipulated after your husband's death." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "So," I said, "they're saying I'm incapable." "Yes," he replied, which contradicts their previous attempts to secure power of attorney. I closed my eyes. They're not thinking strategically anymore, he continued. They're reacting. Reaction is expensive. Within days, the second consequence surfaced, this one financial. Stone's business partner called me directly. His voice was careful, professional, but there was an edge to it that made my stomach tighten. I thought you should know, he said. Your son is liquidating assets. I leaned back against the cabin counter. To cover losses? I asked. To cover assumptions, he replied. He planned for money that never arrived. That sentence stayed with me long after the call ended. Assumptions are the most fragile currency there is. The third consequence was social. Katie had built her life on credibility, on carefully curated appearances, polished connections, the quiet power of being trusted. When her attorney filed documents questioning my mental capacity, it triggered mandatory disclosures, and people noticed. They asked questions. Why now? Why so aggressively? Why your own mother? Explanations stumbled and stories shifted, and in the absence of a clean narrative, judgment filled the gap. I watched it all from the cabin, reading fragments on my phone without comment. I didn't correct anything. I didn't defend myself. Truth doesn't need defending once it has momentum. That night, Maggie called. They're blaming each other, she said quietly. It's bad. I imagined it easily, the accusations, the frantic rewriting of memory, the desperate search for someone to carry the weight of failure. Are you safe? I asked. Yes. Then that's enough. 2 weeks later, the court date was set. I attended virtually from the cabin, sunlight warming my shoulders, birdsong drifting in through the open window. I wore a simple blouse, my hair pulled back, my posture calm. On the screen, my children sat stiff and pale. They didn't look at me. Their lawyers spoke for them. So did mine. When the judge began reviewing documentation, the trust clauses, the attempted accesses, the forwarded messages, the inconsistencies, the tone shifted. This was no longer a family dispute. It was a record, a pattern. The judge's voice was measured. Based on the evidence presented, he said, the court finds no basis for claims of incapacity or undue influence. Katie's face collapsed inward. Stone went very still. The judge continued. Furthermore, the documented attempts to access protected assets raise concerns regarding coercive behavior. Coercive. The words settled heavily in the room. The case wasn't finished, but something irreversible had happened. They were no longer controlling the story, and that was everything. The ruling didn't end the war. It ended the illusion. From the outside, it might have looked like nothing had changed, no arrests, no dramatic exits, no sudden confessions, but beneath the surface, everything my children had built their confidence on began to disintegrate quietly and systematically. The moment the court dismissed their claims, a cascade followed. Banks froze discretionary movement on accounts tied, however loosely, to pending review. Advisors, once warm and responsive, became distant, careful with their language, slow to return calls. Risk does that to people. At the cabin, I felt the aftershocks before I saw them. My phone lit up with messages from numbers I hadn't saved, assistants, intermediaries, people who had never spoken to me before but suddenly needed reassurance. I gave none. Griffin called the next morning. They're hemorrhaging, he said. Loans are being called, credit lines revoked. I pictured Stone always in motion, always forward-facing, now forced into stillness by numbers that refuse to cooperate. Stillness is cruel to men who believe momentum is identity. And Katie? I asked. He paused. She's isolated, he said. No one wants to be associated with a claim like that. It raises too many questions. Questions were lethal in the circles she'd cultivated. By the end of the week, Maggie sent a message. They want to settle. I stared at the words for a long time. Settlement. The word suggested compromise, balance, mercy. It suggested that there was still something to negotiate. I didn't reply because mercy isn't a currency you demand. 2 days later, Katie broke the silence herself. Her message was long, measured, deliberate, threaded with the kind of regret that appears only when consequences become unavoidable. We made mistakes. We were grieving. We didn't mean to hurt you. This has gone too far. As if there were a line somewhere behind us that could be redrawn if she stepped carefully enough. I forwarded the message to Griffin. His response came quickly. This strengthens our position. That afternoon, I walked the perimeter of the cabin land, boots crunching over leaves Bastian and I had once raked together. I stopped at the old fence line he had repaired every spring, remembering how he'd explained patiently that boundaries mattered precisely because people resented them. They'll test you, he'd said once. Not because they're evil, because they're curious what you'll tolerate. He had been right. That evening, Maggie arrived without warning. She looked thinner, tired in a way sleep could not fix. They're spiraling, she said quietly. They think you're punishing them. I handed her a glass of water. I'm protecting myself, I replied. There's a difference. She nodded. They don't see it. No, I thought. They never had. Before she left, she showed me a message Stone had sent her. Raw, unfiltered, furious. If Mom doesn't back off, she'll destroy us. I handed the phone back gently. She's already decided, I said.
I'd like to take a moment and pause. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Please show a kindness by clicking like and subscribe. It would help our channel so much. Let's continue our story.
Griffin filed the motion the next morning, a formal request to enforce the forfeiture clause, the one Bastian had drafted not as vengeance, but as a final line of defense. If granted, it would end everything, no appeals to family, no future leverage, no inheritance to fight over. That night, I sat by the fire and allowed myself a thought I had avoided until now. I was no longer reacting. I was choosing, and choice. Choice was freedom. The word felt distant when Griffin first used it. Forfeiture. It sounded procedural, something that happened to property, not people. A mechanism, a clause. Clean and contained. I would learn how wrong that assumption was. The hearing was scheduled quickly, faster than any of them expected. Courts lose patience when manipulation disguises itself as family concern and the paper trail my children had created was no longer ambiguous. Patterns rarely are. I attended virtually again, seated at the cabin table where sunlight fell in clean, unbroken lines across the wood. I wore pale blue, not morning black, not defiant white, just pale blue. On the screen, my children looked diminished, smaller like figures who had stepped too close to a fire and only then realized heat carries consequence. Katie sat rigid, her spine straight as if posture alone could restore control. Stone leaned back in his chair, arms crossed tightly, jaw locked in a way I recognized from childhood, anger disguised as certainty. Maggie sat apart, hands folded, eyes lowered. She didn't look at me. I was grateful for that mercy. The judge reviewed the clause carefully. I watched his eyes move across the page, slow and deliberate, unimpressed. This clause, he said at last, is unambiguous. Katie's attorney shifted. It is also enforceable, the judge continued, provided the conditions outlined have been satisfied. Griffin stood. They have, he said simply. There was no drama in how he presented it. No accusations, no embellishment, just evidence, timelines, documents, records of attempted access, messages forwarded without commentary. The story my children had tried to control, told cleanly. When the judge spoke again, his voice carried weight. The court finds that the conditions triggering forfeiture have been met. Katie's breath caught audibly. Stone stood. This is insane, he said sharply. We're his children. The judge didn't raise his voice. Being someone's child doesn't grant immunity from consequence, he replied, nor does it entitle you to their estate. The ruling followed swiftly. All future claims to Bastian's inheritance were revoked. The house, the cabin, the trust. Mine exclusively. The screen went dark shortly after. I remained seated. I didn't feel relief the way I'd imagined. What I felt was weightlifting. A pressure I hadn't realized I was carrying finally released its grip on my chest. I stepped outside and stood barefoot on the cool earth, the forest breathing around me. The world didn't pause to mark the moment my children lost everything they had tried to take, nor should it have. My phone buzzed once. A message from Katie. "You've destroyed us." I read it slowly, then I deleted it. Destruction implies intent. All I had done was refuse to disappear quietly so others could live comfortably. That night, I slept with the windows open, the sounds of the forest wrapping around me like something protective. I dreamed of Bastian, not ill or not fading, but laughing, telling me I was stronger than I knew. In the morning, the shame would begin its slow work. But for now, I rested. Shame doesn't arrive like a storm. It seeps. It settles into corners, stains conversations, alters the way names are spoken or avoided. It has patience. It waits for the moment when outrage fades and curiosity sharpens into judgment. My children met it separately. Katie first. Her life had been built on reputation, on the careful cultivation of trust, discretion, influence. She had always believed power lived in proximity, in knowing the right people and being seen in the right rooms. Those rooms closed to her quietly. Committee invitations disappeared. Luncheons were postponed indefinitely. Emails were acknowledged, but not answered. When she entered spaces that once welcomed her, conversations shifted just enough to let her know she was no longer central. People smiled and stepped away. The accusation she'd made against me, the implication that I was incapable, manipulable, followed her like a shadow she could not outrun. In professional circles, it raised a question no one wanted near them. If she could do this to her own mother, what would she do to us? Stone's fall was louder. He had built his life on momentum, on expansion and risk, disguised as confidence. Deals had been planned around money that never existed. Loans taken against futures that evaporated overnight. The calls came fast, then they stopped. Assets were liquidated at losses he would never admit to. Projects stalled. Partnerships dissolved under the weight of uncertainty. Men like Stone do not fail gracefully, they unravel. I heard pieces of it secondhand from acquaintances, from Maggie when she called late at night and needed someone to witness what she could no longer carry alone. "He keeps saying you did this to him," she told me once, her voice tired. "Like you took something that was already his." I closed my eyes. "I took nothing," I said. "I kept what was mine." Maggie bore the fallout differently. She left, moved cities, changed her number, took a job far from the family orbit, far from the expectations and the wreckage. She sent me a message before she went. I didn't win, but I don't think I lost either. I understood exactly what she meant. I stayed at the cabin through the season's turn. Spring softened the land. I repaired what had been neglected, planted new things where old growth had failed. Each task grounded me in something real, something that didn't argue, demand, or resent. One afternoon, a package arrived without a return address. Inside was a framed photograph of Bastian and me, younger, our children gathered around us, all of us smiling at something unseen. The edges were worn, the glass smudged from handling. On the back, in Katie's handwriting, were the words, "I didn't think you would fight back." I sat with that sentence for a long time, then I placed the photograph on the shelf. She had underestimated me and I had survived it. When I called Griffin to close the remaining matters, he hesitated. "Are you sure?" he asked. "There's more you could pursue." "I'm done," I replied, because justice had already done its work. What remained was living. That evening, I lit a fire and poured a glass of wine and spoke to Bastian out loud. I told him what I had done, what it had cost, what it had saved. The forest listened, and for the first time since the funeral, I felt something unfamiliar and fragile take root. Peace. I didn't expect to see her again. That was the truth I admitted to myself when the knock came light, hesitant, almost apologetic. The kind of knock people use when they already know they are not welcome but hope politeness might earn them entry anyway. I stood on the other side of the door for a long moment, my hand resting on the wood, my breath steady. I could have ignored it. Silence had become a language I spoke fluently, but I opened the door. Katie stood on the porch, thinner than I remembered. Not fragile, just worn in places confidence used to fill. Her coat hung slightly loose on her shoulders, her hair pulled back too tightly, as though discipline might still impose order on what had unraveled. "I won't stay long," she said quickly. "I know," I replied. She stepped inside, stopping just past the threshold, careful not to touch anything. We sat at the small table by the window, the same one where I had read Bastian's letters, where grief had hardened into resolve. She didn't look around. This place didn't belong to her, not even emotionally. "I didn't come to ask for anything," she said. "I know that's over." I waited. People reveal themselves when they're given room. "They won't speak to me anymore," she continued, her voice brittle. "My brother blames me. Maggie moved away. I lost everything." She said the word as if it surprised her. "I didn't think it would end like this." I met her gaze, steady. "Did you think it would end well for me?" Her eyes flickered, then dropped. "I didn't think," she admitted. That was the most honest thing she'd said in years. "I believed," she went on, "that you would always put us first, that no matter what, you'd forgive us." I considered that carefully. "I did put you first," I said at last, "for a very long time, until you made that impossible." Her mouth trembled. "I'm ashamed," she whispered, and I believed her. But belief doesn't require repair. "I don't hate you," I said, "but I won't rebuild what you broke." She nodded slowly, absorbing the finality in my voice. When she stood to leave, she hesitated. "Dad would have been proud of you," she said. I felt that land not as comfort, but as confirmation. "I know," I replied. She left without asking for forgiveness, without bargaining, without touching anything that belonged to me. I closed the door and leaned my forehead against it. Some endings don't ache, they settle. That week, I returned to the city one last time. I packed what remained in the old house, the echoes, the artifacts, the life that no longer fit. I sold it quietly, no announcements, no sentimentality. The cabin would remain. I transferred the remainder of the inheritance into a charitable trust in Bastian's name. Education, housing, legal aid for women who had been told they were too old, too weak, too kind to fight back. Legacy, I had learned, isn't what you leave your children, it's what you refuse to let die. When I returned to the cabin, the sun was just rising. I stood on the porch and breathed deeply, the air cool and clean in my lungs. I was no longer afraid of being alone because I had myself. People imagine victory as noise. They imagine raised voices, public apologies, some theatrical moment where the balance of power announces itself so clearly no one could ever mistake it again. They imagine triumph as something that demands witnesses. They are wrong. Real victory is almost silent. It is waking up without dread, tightening your chest before your eyes even open. It's making plans without calculating who they might upset. It's the absence of vigilance. In the months that followed, my life simplified itself. The legal matters closed one by one, not with finality so much as inevitability. Documents were signed, accounts stabilized. The charitable trust began its work quietly funding legal aid, education, temporary housing. I read reports not for validation, but for grounding. Proof that what had been salvaged was doing good beyond me. Bastian's name lived on, not in headlines or inheritance battles, but in the quiet relief of people who had been told they had no power left. That felt right. I settled fully into the cabin. I learned which boards needed reinforcing before winter, which trees dropped limbs after heavy rain. I planted a small garden in the spring, hands deep in soil that asked nothing of me but patience. Growth, I learned, isn't dramatic, it is consistent. In the evenings, I read. I cooked meals sized correctly for one person. I stopped apologizing to empty rooms. Occasionally, fragments of my former life reached me. A mutual acquaintance mentioned Katie had taken a position far from the circles she once ruled. A quieter life, someone said, though the word quieter sounded suspiciously like smaller. Stone downsized, sold what he could not sustain. Learned, I hoped, the difference between ambition and entitlement. I didn't reach out. Distance was not punishment, it was alignment. Once, months later, I saw Katie again. It was accidental, a cafe in a town neither of us belonged to anymore. She looked healthier, lighter. The tension that once pulled her shoulders inward had eased. We shared a nod, nothing more. That was enough. As autumn settled in, I found myself sitting on the porch one evening, a blanket over my shoulders, the sky bruised purple and gold as the sun sank behind the trees. The forest moved gently around me, alive but unintrusive. I thought of the woman I had been at the beginning of this grieving, disoriented, clinging to the belief that love alone was protection. I didn't judge her. She had loved deeply, she had given freely, she had trusted because trust was how she understood the world, but she had also learned. I had not taken revenge, I had taken my life back. I had refused to be erased quietly, refused to be managed into irrelevance, refused to confuse motherhood with martyrdom, and in doing so, I had won not because my children lost, but because I endured without becoming cruel. The cabin lights flickered on as dusk deepened. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called. I closed my eyes and breathed. Nothing else could be taken from me. What remained was mine.
Sometimes we all need shelter, not just from rain, but from the storms of life, the bad days, the hard moments, the times when we feel utterly alone. In memory of everyone who's ever stood in the rain, feeling hopeless. In honor of everyone who's ever stopped to ask, "Are you okay?" In gratitude for the quiet heroes who transform grief into kindness, pain into purpose, and one simple act into a movement that changes lives. May we all be umbrellas for someone else's storm. God bless you.